All right. Woo, I get to see everybody. I love it. Okay, well, first of all, I'm really delighted to be here. We were at an event earlier in the week, and soil is not a sexy topic unless you're a farmer or you're a gardener or you're somebody who at some point in your life has had a deep experience or some education that has kind of changed your view, maybe even changed your body. So the hidden half of nature was very much a journey for both of us. And interestingly enough, it was a journey in which we didn't really go anywhere except we opened the back door and stepped out into the backyard and started on a project that I kind of dragged Dave into it, okay? We need to be honest about this because I'm a biologist, and ever since I was a little kid, I've been enamored with the botanical world. I grew up south of Denver, and so it's not the greenest place in the winter, as you know, and I ended up going to school in Santa Cruz, California, and when I got out there and January rolled around, I thought, oh my God, what kind of place is this? It is nothing but green, green, green. And that only fueled my plant lust. And finally, when David and I bought our house in Seattle, this is some time ago, what you see there is the side yard. And to me, that was one big blank slate for a garden. And I have to say, the house was built in 1918 by Norwegians, and this is, I do not mean to offend anyone of who is Norwegian or of Norwegian ancestry out there, but not really a gardening culture. So almost 100 years, and this is what the place looks like on the outside. What we have here, folks, is an old-growth lawn, and it was not biologically interesting, it was not aesthetically interesting, and so I set about thinking, what can we do with this? What can I do with this? And so I worked for a long time on these kind of, you know, botanist ransom note kind of things, right? I'm drawing all over photographs, I'm drawing all over magazines to try and get in my mind's eye, what is the potential of this place and what could we turn it into? And so we ended up getting, you all understand this because you work with the land, but you know how things kind of happen and you kind of get behind schedule and it's partly your fault, but it's also has to do with circumstances out of your control. Well, this is where we landed in mid-August, the summer that we were putting the garden in. All of this planting and getting the lot prepped was supposed to have been done by April or May, okay? Now, yeah, it rains a lot in Seattle, but not in the middle of August, not in August at all. So here we were. Does this look like my dream dirt? No, this is dirt that is dashing my dreams, okay? This is dirt that sent me into a complete and utter panic. And frankly, between you and me and Dave, this is embarrassing. How does this happen to the likes of us, right? We got Mr. Dirt over there, we got, you know, Ms. Biologist here, and it's like, oh no. Oh no. All right, so keep your eye on that, that arrow in the slide on that roof line there, that'll come back. And so this was really the beginning of my education as a gardener. And I call it the Organic Matter Chronicles. I had dabbled enough in gardening in college, but always on these tiny little postage stamp kind of places where I'd lived with, you know, a house full of roommates and things like that. And what I figured, okay, it's the middle of August. We got dozens of plants sitting around in black plastic pots, heating up by the day, maybe even dying. And I thought, we're gonna get these in the ground quick, and then I need to go find as much organic matter that is free, that is cheap, or that is close by. And so that is what I set about to do. And of course you have to paint your wheelbarrow up, because then it makes things go faster. But this is another part of my education. This is a really kind of fossil fuel intensive theme here on my wheelbarrow. The next wheelbarrow, I'm glad to report, will be painted with microbes, okay? But I do have to say, when I look at this, I feel like I just, sort of the blue healer in me comes out and I get moving just a little bit faster doing things. All right, so what kind of things was I collecting? You can read all of those labels on those things. Where you see a capital N, that just stands for nitrogen source. Capital C stands for carbon source. And all of this was collected very close to where we live, with the exception you see a couple mussel shells in there. And so if a friend had clams or mussels for dinner, I'd say, save me your shells, because they're going into the mulch mix. Now, we don't have animals on our city lot in Seattle, but actually some neighbors did have some pygmy goats. And I haven't graduated to pygmy goats yet. Maybe I will. But what we do have is we don't live that far from the Seattle Zoo. And they have a product called Zoodoo. You see it there. It's pile C. And Zoodoo is the composted manure of elephants and giraffes and wildebeests and antelopes and everything have in there at the Seattle Zoo. I got someone laughing really hard here. But not everybody can get Zoodoo, because there's only so many elephants and giraffes and stuff in the zoo. So you got to put a postcard in. And I was lucky enough to get chosen for the Zoodoo lottery a number of times. So I was pretty excited about that. And the deal with Zoodoo is you just pull your vehicle up there, and you can load up as much as you can put in your vehicle. So I had a little Subaru Impreza, and I had buckets and bags stacked to the roof. Then I noticed there was somebody really smart. They borrowed somebody's milk delivery truck, and they loaded the whole darn thing with Zoodoo up to the windows. I mean, that's how it goes in Seattle when you have these kinds of sources of organic matter close by. And so you're wondering, okay, well, what'd you do with this organic matter? Because of where we were in August, I had thought, yeah, I got to get this stuff all out in the soil, and I got to dig it in. And then I began to realize, you're nuts. I'd done enough of that kind of work in my short gardening career before this to know that that's really pretty backbreaking. And you just never get stuff thoroughly mixed in, and you run into pockets of this and that later on. So I thought, okay, well, I'm just going to mix it up in the barrel, and then I'm going to layer it on top of the soil. And if I get around later to digging it in, then I'll do that. And I'm happy to say I never did get around to digging it in. And this was one of those aha. This was an epiphany for me. So this is up here, just another example of mulch mix. This is a late spring, early summer mix. I've got a lot of green material on hand at this time of year because I'm pruning stuff, and I really like to mix the fresh green stuff with a base of decaying wood chips, because then I get all this green stuff as my nitrogen source, and all of this brown stuff, the wood chips, is a carbon source, and it mixes together nicely. And so I naively thought that, I'll just collect this stuff, and it'll just be a couple-year project, and I'll just be, laying it on there, and it'll sit there, and it'll all be great. Ha, ha, ha. I had to gripe to Dave several growing seasons in. Honey, this is like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. You start at one end, and when you get to the other end, I got to go back to the beginning because it already needs more mulch. And so in the back of my mind was this question of, where is all of this mulch going anyway? And that was a question that led us eventually into sort of more research into this. But I also want to say there's the living goods. And this is compost tea. I managed to get a hold of a compost tea brewer at Northwest Flower and Garden Show. This is going a ways back. And I also have a worm bin, not an earthworm bin, but a red wriggler worm bin. And these are the kind of worms that dine on food scraps, the food scraps that Dave and I were left over from meals and so on. And so you have a worm bin, and they produce, I want to say, probably some of the finest compost I have ever had the privilege to use and make. And so I would grab a handful of that worm bin compost, put it in this sack that's tied onto the edge of the bucket there, pour a bit of a nutrient solution in, turn the aerator on, and 24 to 48 hours later, depending on what the air temperature was, I would spray my compost tea on every single plant in the garden, or I might water it in. And these were magical times for me because I sort of felt like this, I don't know, this other creature that was communing with the plants, and I found this really cool trombone-style sprayer from England that did not look anything like the kind of sprayers that you often see people using who are spraying some kind of biocide. And so it was an eye-opening time too, because the garden was young at this point, and like a child, a puppy, a kitten, a seedling, it's a very vulnerable time of life. And I would see plants ailing, and I would get the tea brewing, and then I would go on and spritz things. So I'm a big fan of compost tea. I think we need a lot more research on it because it's one of these things that's variable. Like my worm bin compost is completely different probably than somebody else's, and how does that transfer through to the quality of the tea? But in any event, this was probably 5-6 years after we put the garden in. And what you can see here, you can see a mulch mix on top there that's been slowly breaking down. You can see that dark layer that has begun to appear. And this is new soil in essence. It's really, it's rich in organic matter. I wasn't adding the mineral part of soil, but certainly the organic part. And then below that, you can see that awful soil that we still have. And this was another lesson for me to, there was no way, soil's way too precious a resource, even in a city, to think that we can scrape this up and take it away and throw it away. I mean, if you're dealing with some kind of a really serious toxic issue, perhaps you might want to do some removal, but really what I learned was we got to do what we can with what we have with where we are. And I say that didn't turn out half bad. That turned out pretty good. You heard Dave say, on average it takes nature 1,000 years or so to build an inch of soil. So this is in 6 or 7 years. So this is what got us thinking more and more about soil. And so here you can see the soil that we started with on your left and about where we are now on the right. Several years ago, we worked with a person at UW. She came over and collected soil samples from several different places in the garden to take a look at carbon content, because, right, that darker soil has got more carbon in it. And what we learned is that it ranged from a high of around 14 or 15% in our veg bed, and that's partly because that's where I dedicate really most of the worm bin compost is to the veg bed. And I've been messing around with biochar, and I've been messing around with certain mulches in the veg bed. So that's where it's highest. Out in the other beds, it's maybe around 6% or so. And this is probably not too surprising to those of you who come from prairie states, but beneath our lawn, which is a mix of grasses and herbs, we had carbon content somewhere around 8%, because these roots are alive on the lawn year-round. So this was the other thing we learned. Okay, so if all of this is going on above ground or below ground, what is happening up here? So you all grow crops, whatever that might be, soybeans, corn, what have you, wheat, covers. These are my crops. There's not been really a drop of NPK put on this garden. And this is what you can do by paying attention to organic matter and paying attention to the way that the green body of a plant really works. I'm kind of a nut for maple trees in particular. I like to grow what grows well in Seattle. I see all kinds of people bringing these plants and, gardener friends and various other places. I'm like, that'll be dead in about a year. They're going to get about 5 years out of that, and then it'll be done. So I also like to pay attention to what does well with the conditions that I have. And in addition to those crops, this is my kale crop in the veg bed. And finally, of course, what is a garden without flowers? And when you live in a place, Seattle's green, but it can be cold and dark and dreary in our winters. And so I love when the flowers come on because it's a signal that summer is finally upon us in Seattle. All right, so I had done some heavy lifting. I dragged Dave into doing some of the heavy lifting too, and he was always a good sport about it. But really, this was sort of my endeavor with the garden. And when I started griping to him, as I had mentioned, about where is all of this mulch going, I just feel like I'm on a treadmill with this stuff. And so we started to look into the life of the soil. And it begins with these chompers. I call them the chompers, and then, of course, the grinders and the chewers. And these are the macro forms of soil life, and they're doing the initial physical deconstruction of, a big old wood chip or some kind of a leaf. But where it all eventually ends up is here in the microbial world. And what you've got there in these 4 images, I want to focus mostly on the top 2. You've got a clump of bacteria on the left. You've got on the right there the green fluorescent thing. That's a root hair. And then those are spores of mycorrhizal fungi, and they're hyphae. They're thread-like hyphae around that root hair. And on the bottom is a nematode. Now, a nematode is kind of a vacuum cleaner for bacteria. Beneficial types of nematodes, they feed on bacteria. And what it tells us, what we know is that bacteria happen to be fairly nitrogen rich. These little single-celled organisms are tiny, tiny little nitrogen packets in the soil. So a nematode hoovers in bacteria, and what do you think nematode manure is rich in? It's rich in nitrogen, in part because all of these bacteria are rich in nitrogen. And the cool thing is, this nitrogen is right where I'd like to have it, near the roots of my plants. And so this is a way of sort of working with what we now call the soil microbiome. So I'll talk a bit more about microbiomes, but these are the communities of microbes that, they're supposed to be in the soil. They're indigenous to the soil. That's where we want them. And as we'll see, they do quite a few things. And this is just an illustration. I'm sure you've probably all seen things like this, but I like to remind myself of how interrelated and connected all of this stuff is below ground, all of these life forms. It's really an eat and be eaten world. This is about cycling nutrients, right? From bacteria into the bodies of nematodes back out again. And the other thing I like to remind myself about is the plant diet, because we know that in just sort of a very big picture way, plants are getting 2 of the things that they need from the atmosphere, nitrogen and carbon. And if they've got nitrogen-fixing bacteria, that of course gets turned into a form of nitrogen the plant can take up. So those 2 things from the atmosphere. From the plant's own green body, organic matter, like all of that stuff I was turning into my mulch mixes. And then the other place that a plant's diet comes from is these rocks. That's where all these minerals are. The calcium, the iron, the zinc, right in our earth, in those rocks. And then, of course, water. So this is what a plant's green body relies on, is all of these things. But there's something else that green body needs, and it doesn't come from dead things like carbon and nitrogen. It doesn't come from the organic matter. It comes from other forms of life in the soil, and where all of that happens is in a place called the rhizosphere. And exudates, this is how all of this works. Exudates, just think of that word, kind of roll it over in your mind. Exudates are exuding. They're exuding, oozing, and flowing out of a plant's roots into this place called a rhizosphere. And as it turns out, the rhizosphere is really a biological bazaar where these exudates are feeding the root microbiome, these innumerable communities of microbes that are congregating around the roots of a plant. And why is this? Because these exudates that the plant is manufacturing, the estimate is that a plant uses somewhere around 40% of its photosynthetic, the energy it makes with through photosynthesis to fabricate these exudates in its green body. And these exudates are things like proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. You probably all had some combination of that in your breakfast this morning. So these are meals for microbes, really. And like any organism, you have bacteria in that rhizosphere. They're consuming these exudates, and they are excreting, we sometimes call these things waste products, but we need a whole new way of thinking about, I'll say it bluntly, microbe crap, all right? Because what microbes are excreting out of their bodies, biochemists and plant biologists, they call these microbial metabolites, and they are hugely important to a plant's well-being. And so bacteria are consuming the exudates, producing these metabolites the plant is taking back in, as you can see here. And then there's fungi. And of course fungi, because these hyphae can travel through the soil, they're out there prospecting far away from where a plant's root system can go. And they're pulling in things like phosphorus. And you all know that the P of NPK is one of the 3 key things that a plant needs for growth. And the fungi are acquiring that phosphorus and transporting it back to the roots of the plant through their hyphae. And so what we have going on in this biological bazaar is one of the grandest symbioses on our planet. And it actually turns out, plant biologists have been studying, there's the part of the fungi that is either on the outside of the root, or in some cases, it's growing inside of the root. But on the far end, out in the soil, there's other symbioses going on between bacteria and that fungi to dissolve all of these minerals out of rocks or to get that phosphorus into the fungal hyphae. So it's symbioses nested within symbioses. And if you think about it, long before there were the likes of gardeners or farmers, all the botanical world had was this symbiosis. That's what it relied on to get the things that it needed. And here is an actual picture of fetching fungi. You can see that thread-like structure moving through some kind of a soil particle or rock fragment, getting things, minerals, and pulling them back. All right. And the other thing that happens in the rhizosphere is it's not just about nutrient acquisition and processing, it's also about flow of information. So here we have an insect herbivore munching away on a leaf, and the plant doesn't like that, but this plant is stuck in place. And so what it does is it sends signaling compounds down to the root system, gins up an exudate that contains that signaling molecule, and communicates to its root microbiome, I've got a pest up here above ground and I need some help. I don't really need to kill it, I just need to get it off my back and onto the back of some other plant. So how about you, root microbiome? You gin up some metabolites that I can take up through the root system that can stimulate the plant immune system to produce defensive compounds to get this herbivore off. So it's this two-way information system that is going on between the above ground part of a plant's green body and below ground. And I don't know about you, but we've probably, whether you're, there's these kind of images in botany textbooks, probably agronomy textbooks, various kinds of literature. Okay, look at this. About 2/3 of the plant that's shown in this is above ground, and it got those, you know, those big leaves. And look at that root system. You ask me, I don't know, that looks kind of, I don't know, kind of paltry. Okay, well, here is the reality. That is fake news. That is not really how a plant's green body is sort of structured and really how it works. Because what we know about the rhizosphere and what we know about the root system is that it is a place of plant intelligence. And what this means is that the root system, as much as it is a gut, it is also a brain. It is a marvelous, marvelous organ, the root of a plant, because of all of the things that it can do. And so here's the deal. We've got that root plunging down into the soil. You've got dead soil on the left. You've got an alive and thriving soil there on the right. And if that root is this combo gut and brain, then here is where we are going to have a smarter plant. A plant that can deal with weather conditions, with pathogens, with all that Mother Nature has always thrown at the botanical world. And so to sum it up, Dave and I, it's kind of weird to think that plants have a diet, but really they do. And the diet of a plant is just as important as the diet, say, of an animal or a person. And I'll just draw your attention to the two largest arrows on this slide. First, on the left, on a fertilizer diet, see, fertilizers are so seductive. I've used fertilizers before. They put biomass on a plant like nothing else. And it's sort of an experience that can make you stand back and go, wow, that is fast growth and that's a lot of growth. But look at that root system. That's anemic, that's paltry. The microbial metabolites coming out of a plant on a fertilizer diet are hardly anything, because there's hardly much of a root system there, because plants are very smart. If you provide things that they need in other forms, like fertilizers or like herbicides, sure, as we all know, you can get a plant across the harvest finish line for that. But you've also spent a lot of money on that stuff. And sometimes they don't work, you know, exactly how you would like them to. So, you know, everything about farming and gardening and nature is kind of double-edged. It's not to say never use those things, but it is to say be aware of the capabilities of a plant's green body on a soil health diet. Look at the bucket loads of beneficial microbial metabolites coming through on that soil health diet. And why is that? Look at the density of those roots and think about the exudates flowing out of that biomass. And that's what a soil health diet will do for a garden and for a farm. Okay, now all those microbes all over plants, coating and swathing the plant's green body, we are no different, my friends. It's just that plant scientists were on to the plant microbiome long before it was called a microbiome, because the soil is one of the richest places for microbial diversity on land on our planet. So it was really no surprise to plant scientists that you did some analyses and it was like, oh yeah, there are a lot of microbes down there in the soil and they're all over the plant. People, we thought, we're a little different, we're a little special. I'm really sure I like this idea about microbes all over us and in us. Well, my friends, that is the truth. And Charles Schultz knew this somehow a long time ago. And a few quick factoids on our microbiome. As it turns out, there's some very interesting analogies between our body and the plant body. When it comes to cells, it's estimated that there's about anywhere from 1 microbial cell to upwards of around 3 microbial cells for every one of our cells. So we're either even with them or they're, 30% more of them than us. So as a biologist, I find that kind of cool. I also find that, in some situations that maybe isn't such a great thing, but we're outnumbered in terms of cells. And when it comes to the genes, so we each got about 23,000 genes from our mom and our dad, protein coding genes. But when you add in the genome of the bacterial members of our microbiome, it's estimated that adds about 2 million more genes to all of the genes within our body. But it's not just bacteria that are part of our microbiome. We've got viruses, we've got fungi, and perhaps more things that we still don't quite yet know about. But the sum total of all of the microbes and the genomes that they bring into our body is estimated to be somewhere around 4 to 6 million more genes, right? That's a lot more than 23,000. And what we know about relationship between genes turning on and off and what causes genes to express or not express, that has a lot to do with our health, right? And it's not just us who has this microbiome. All of these animals, including the animals on your farm, have a microbiome. And the point is not to try to memorize this, please don't. But along the, sort of on the right top of this slide, those are different phyla of bacteria, and there's 1, 2, 3, there's 6. So phyla, that's a taxonomic grouping. We are in a phylum that all vertebrates belong to. That's just us, fish, dogs, anything with a backbone. Microbiome has 6 phyla. That is a lot of biodiversity, folks, a lot. And these microbiomes, they're different for a whale or a salmon than they are for a chicken, a cow, or a corn plant. And the kinds of numbers in terms of genes that I just mentioned before, the same thing is true for all of these other animals and plants. And for me, the microbiome and learning more about it led to a part of the human body that I never knew much about, and I never thought I would be up in front of a room of people talking about one of the most little talked about places in our body. This is the bottom of our digestive tract, known as the large intestine or the colon. And why am I talking with you about the colon? Here's why. Most of your microbiome lives in your colon, not on the top of your head, on the back of your hand, or anywhere else. It's in the colon. The other thing is, most of your immune system is wrapped around the digestive tract, and at that, most of it is around the colon as well. So you picture a Venn diagram, where you get 2 overlapping circles, and the colon is like the body's headquarters for many, many things. And I took a deep dive into the colon and into the immune system, in part because I was facing a cancer diagnosis when Dave and I were writing this book, and I started to hear all of this stuff about the immune system, that should be gobbling up and knocking out these cancer cells. And I thought, oh, that's very interesting. Somehow my immune system kind of fell down on the job. I'm glad to say that that is all behind me now, but I have a huge appreciation these days for what the immune system can do. And just notice on this slide, because the next series of slides we're going to take a closer look at the colon. And that central area where you've got everything rushing through, that's called the lumen. And in that mucus layer there, that's where much of the human microbiome is hunkered down in, right? The lumen, this river, and you're a little one-celled organism, you're not going to hang on to anything, folks. You need to find your habitat in the colon, hunker down, and do what the human microbiome can do, which is this. This is a cross-section. At the top of the slide is the lumen, and at the bottom of the slide, on the outside of the colon wall, you have a dendritic cell. 2 in this picture. Dendritic cells are just a kind of an immune cell, and what the job of this cell to do is it's a bit, it's an explorer. Its job is to explore what is inside the colon of this person that I live in, and specifically what members of the microbiome are in here. And the way the dendritic cell does that, you can see what's going on in here in this slide. It's kind of a shapeshifter. It can slide an arm up in between two of your colon cells, and it's going to get a molecular sample, and it's going to come back down out of your colon. Might be doing that right now. We just don't know, but it's likely. And with that sample, the dendritic cell has some cousins in the immune system. You've probably heard of T cells. They're the subject of a lot of immunotherapy these days. And that molecular sample will activate T cells. There's about a dozen different kinds, and they do all kinds of different things in our body. But one thing they do, one of their major jobs, is to control inflammation. Because had my immune system been on top of things, the inflammatory process would have activated a series of other steps, and the T cell would have been able to find those cancer cells and take them out. But it's only a certain kind of molecular sample that will activate a T cell. If it's not the right kind, the T cell just kind of sits there and doesn't do anything, waiting around for the next dendritic cell to bring it another sample to see, is that the right kind? Is that the right kind? Eventually, though, a T cell will get activated, and this is where it turns into a pro-inflammatory T cell. It goes out and it does all of these things. I'm hoping my immune system and Dave's is working now, because we got this crud from I don't know where, somewhere on the road. And I'm like, come on, we need to rev up here and get rid of this cold bug. That is what the pro-inflammatory process is about. It's normal, it's healthy, it's what you want to have happening. But once the problem is taken care of, it's kind of like a controlled burn, right? You want that pile of debris burnt up, and then you want the fire done and out, because if the fire gets out of hand and then your house burns down or something else burns down, and you do not want that. That is big damage, big harm, and the same in our bodies. Once the inflammation is quelled, you want your anti-inflammatory T cells. They'll sense this, they'll get moving, communicate with the pro-inflammatory T cells and say, okay, bringing everything back down to homeostasis. It's an even keel. We can just go on about our daily business. So this, in large part, is the job of the microbiome. It is to communicate and signal and provide information to the immune system, so the immune system can do all of the things that it does to protect us and keep us healthy. And this shouldn't surprise you, right? Our gut, with its microbiome and all of the nutrient processing and all of these things it does, it is the seat of our intelligence in many, many ways. And what's very different about this view of our immune system and microbes is that this is a burgeoning area of science. It's only been in about the last decade that anyone from gastroenterologists to immunologists to biologists have really started to put together this picture of the foundation of our health. And you're like, wow, it's 2020. How did we miss this? How did we miss the fact that it's the presence of microbes, not their absence, that is super important for our well-being? How did we miss this? Think back to that dendritic cell. What if we're missing a member of our microbiome, and that dendritic cell is never going to find that molecular sample to activate the appropriate kind of T cell? What if we get too many pro-inflammatory processes in our body? I'll go into that a little bit later, but suffice it to say, when it comes to microbiomes around the root and around the gut, we really want to be thinking about protection, restoration, and I'll get into a little bit later, cultivation, okay?